Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 447. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show. Just want to give people a quick reminder that we are holding a fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. It's been quite a while since we held a fundraiser. We are pretty frugal with where we spend money. Essentially, all the money goes to creating content, paying staff, paying writers for articles. So help us stay in business, help us keep creating great libertarian content, books, articles, news stories, podcasts, videos, just tons of great stuff that we produce at the Libertarian Institute. And it's all possible because we have a lot of great donors who come together and, pay us enough to keep doing this stuff. So we really appreciate it. And if you head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate, there are some kit bats there, free ebooks, free books plus other stuff. So depending on how much you donate, you'll get some great Libertarian Institute swag. And now let's get into today's show. First up here, House passes $886 billion National Defense Authorization Act. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, July 16th. The House on Friday passed its version of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act in a vote of 219 to 210, which largely fell along partisan lines due to amendments added by Republicans relating to social policies in the military. The Republican amendments covered abortion, transgender surgery, and diversity initiatives. Only 4 Democrats voted in favor of the bill, and 4 Republicans voted against it. Those 4 are Representative Massey, Eli Crane, Andy Briggs, and Ken Buck. The Senate still needs to pass its version of the NDAA, then the 2 chambers will negotiate the final version that will go to President Biden's desk. The Republican amendments packed into the House version will set up a fight between the 2 chambers as Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats will reject them. And this typically happens every year with the NDAA. In fact, I feel like this year, I guess maybe this is more just my perspective of an anti-war activist. There's not a whole lot of really spicy material in this year's NDAA. In past years, we've had resolutions in there that would invoke war powers to end different wars in the Middle East and things like that. But from my understanding, most of that has been just completely shut down. As the House was debating the NDAA, several amendments introduced by Republicans looking to rein in U.S. support for Ukraine were voted down. One amendment, sponsored by Representative Warren Davison, he's a Republican from Ohio, would have required the Biden administration to develop a strategy for the war in Ukraine. It was rejected on a vote of 129 to 103, with only Republicans supporting it. One amendment introduced by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene would have cut $300 million in military aid for Ukraine that was packed into the NDAA, but that failed on a vote of 89 to 341. Representative Matt Gaetz put forward an amendment to cut off all military assistance to Ukraine, which failed on a vote of 70 to 358. Only Republicans supported the last 2 amendments. Green sponsored another amendment that would have prohibited the transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine. Although U.S. cluster bombs have already arrived in the country, the effort failed on a vote of 147 to 276. It received support from almost 100 Republicans and almost 50 Democrats. All right, next up here, an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute earlier this week. Senators introduced bipartisan bill to prevent any president from leaving NATO. Again, July 16th, this one at the Institute. A group of senators have reintroduced legislation to prevent an American president from withdrawing from the North Atlantic Alliance. A version of the bill failed to pass the legislature during the Trump administration. Senators Tim Kaine and Marco Rubio, both members of the Foreign Relations Committee, are the bill's authors. This is a statement from Marco Rubio. NATO serves as an essential military alliance that protects shared national interests and enhances America's international presence. Any decision to leave the alliance should be rigorously debated and considered by the U.S. Congress with the input of the American people. And it's amazing how this works, right? You have all these wars started with essentially no input from the Congress, no input from the American people. But it's only when we want to end wars, then Congress has, or like the Iran nuclear deal, we have to debate getting back into that in Congress. That's what they say that the law requires Congress to be able to debate that. But if Trump just exits that deal, that doesn't require any consent from Congress. And it's always just interesting how it works that, the laws in Washington work if they are encouraging war. But if they're not encouraging war, then they don't seem to work. All right. The North Atlantic Alliance is engaged in a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. Representative Matt Gaetz has argued that it is not in America's interest to be supporting Kiev's war machine. In a recent speech on the House floor, Gaetz said the Biden administration is sleepwalking our great country into a world war. The American people did not sign up for this. Kane argued the bill was needed because the war in Ukraine has exposed Russia's weakness. Putin's brutal war in Ukraine and Finland's ascension and Sweden's pending ascension into NATO all underscore the same thing. NATO is stronger than ever. I'm proud to introduce this bipartisan bill to reaffirm the United States' commitment to NATO and ensure any president can't unilaterally decide to leave the alliance without congressional approval. However, President Biden recently admitted that the White House agreed to send cluster bombs to Ukraine because ammo stockpiles have been depleted. The decision to send cluster bombs to Kiev is a stark reversal for the White House that denounced the usage of the weapon before the war. Senators Richard Blumenthal, Jerry Moran, Dianne Feinstein, Ben Cardin, Angus King, Amy Klobuchar, Jeff Malarkey, and Dick Durbin are additionally co-sponsoring the bill. Senator Cardin believes NATO's deterring Moscow. He said the NATO alliance continues to be a virtual bulwark against Putin's illegal and unprovoked war in Ukraine. America bolstered this alliance at a crucial moment in time, and Congress must show the world that our national commitment to NATO will remain rock solid. We stand with the democratic countries of Europe and guarantee their protection. Russian President Vladimir Putin explained NATO's plans to expand into Ukraine force the invasion. According to the Kremlin, the Russian army will continue to press its advance until Moscow feels it has established an appropriate security situation. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more in detail about the war in Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp. I read this story yesterday in the Washington Post, and I was floored by this, but Dave has a great write-up here. The Washington Post reported Tuesday that U.S. officials believe Ukraine should be launching large-scale assaults against Russia's defensive lines, despite the risk of major losses, and are blaming Ukraine's tactics for the struggling counteroffensive. The report said that the pace of Ukraine's counteroffensives had generated concerns in the West that the government of President Zelensky may not deliver as powerful a blow as it could. The main complaint from the U.S. and other Western countries is that Ukraine is not using combined arms tactics, which integrate infantry, armored vehicles, and artillery. Instead, Ukraine is relying on artillery and sending small teams of engineers to clear minefields, which Ukrainian officials say they are doing to prevent any unnecessary losses. The New York Times also reported that the U.S. is frustrated by Ukraine's caution. The report reads, senior U.S. officials in recent weeks have previously expressed frustration that some Ukrainian commanders, exasperated at the slow pace of the initial assault and fearing increased casualties among their ranks, had reverted to old habits. Decades of Soviet-style training in artillery barrages, rather than sticking with Western tactics and pressing harder to breach the Russian defenses. Ukrainian troops receive combined arms training in NATO countries ahead of the counteroffensive, and the Biden administration wants them to use it. But the Ukrainian forces did launch large armored assaults in the first weeks of the counteroffensive, which resulted in heavy losses. According to the Times, 20% of all of Ukraine's weaponry deployed to the battlefield was damaged or destroyed during the first 2 weeks of the counteroffensive. A Ukrainian general, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, has hit back at Washington's criticism of the counteroffensive, saying Washington would never launch such an assault without air superiority. He has been demanding that the U.S. and NATO provide U.S.-made F-16s, which aren't expected to arrive until next year. According to the Post, U.S. officials are privately saying that Western jets won't make much of a difference due to Russia's extensive air defenses. The chief of staff for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency offered a bleak assessment of Ukraine's prospects at a conference last week, saying that no weapon will be the holy grail to help Ukraine, quote, break through. Despite the situation on the ground for Ukrainian soldiers, the Biden administration is still pushing for more fighting and shows no interest in a ceasefire or diplomacy. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, insisted on Tuesday that the counteroffensive is not a failure. It's far from a failure in my view. I think that it is too early to make that kind of call. I think there is a lot of fighting to go, and I'll stay with what we've said before. This is going to be hard. It's going to be bloody. Now, I want to scroll back up here to Dave's article and just briefly highlight a point here, and that are the tactics. So the Ukrainians, again, in the early days, early weeks of this counteroffensive, so this is going to be the first 2-3 weeks of June, they did what the Americans wanted, which was using artillery, infantry, and armor in order to carry out different kinds of maneuvers to try to breach the Russian defenses. When this happened, the Ukrainians found themselves identified by Russian drones and either targeted by those anti-personnel drones or targeted by other helicopter and air fire, artillery fire. They were trapped inside minefields and, lost, again, as Dave points out in his article, 20% of equipment. And so that was not going well. And so instead, they've started to rely more heavily on artillery fire. And the U.S. is saying, oh, we want Ukraine to use these other tactics for these reasons. But I think it's really because they just don't want Ukraine to engage in any tactics that involve artillery. So I got 2 articles here that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 17th and 18th. The first one here, U.S. General says weapon stockpiles dangerously low, calls for production boost. As Washington ships billions of dollars in arms to Kiev, a general is warning that American weapon stockpiles are becoming dangerously low. The Department of Defense official called for the weapons industry to increase production. General James Hecker issued the stark warning in London. The chief of staff of the air during the name of the conference is the Chief of the Air Staff's Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference 23. And this is one of the statements he made. Now, you add that we have given a lot of munitions away to Ukraine, which I think is exactly what we need to do, but we are going to get dangerously low and sometimes, in some cases, even too low that we don't have enough, he said. According to the Joe Biden administration, the U.S. has approved transferring $42 billion in weapons to Ukraine. The latest security assistance package for Ukraine, authorized on July 7th, includes cluster munitions. Early in the war, the use of cluster munitions had been condemned by the White House. However, President Biden says his administration has reversed its refusal to send the controversial weapons to Ukraine because Washington is running out of conventional ammunition. Hecker went on to call for more production to refill the American arms depots, but warned that the process will take time. He said, we need to get the industry on board to help us out so we can get this going. NATO is dreadfully below where it needs to be and probably not going to get better. Well, it's not going to get better in the short term. But we got to make sure that in the long term, we have the industrial base that can increase what we have. A former Department of Defense employee has warned that the drastic increase in demand for weapons is allowing arms manufacturers to price gouge the American people. Shay Assad, a former contract negotiator at the Department of Defense, said the military-industrial complex was taking advantage of the American taxpayer by exploiting the war in Ukraine. He explained, "We have nowhere else to go. For many of these weapons that are being sent over to Ukraine right now, there's only one supplier, and the companies know it." Despite these issues, Hecker explained that the military convinced Congress that the threat posed by Russia and China causes a real need for an increase in defense spending and weapons manufacturing. He said, "The Air Force is talking to our political leadership in the House and in the Senate about the threat that China has on us. And I think it has energized the Congress given our defense budgets are going up." He continued, "I think they finally realize, what a threat China will be. And then, of course, it's pretty obvious the threat that Russia poses." And so, this is really interesting. I think this last statement was one of the really interesting things I heard from Hecker at that conference, because, what he's saying here is that the military has so much leverage over the Congress that they go in, they have a meeting with some senators, some congressmen, and suddenly they're for supporting more war, more military spending. All right, next up here is a very, kind of similar subject article. U.S. allies running out of weapons to send to Ukraine. And this is Ukraine talking with, probably some different sources. And let's see what they had to say. "The North Atlantic Alliance is running so low on weapons it may be unable to keep supplying Kiev," according to CNN. A high-ranking British defense official said the predicament was created because NATO has no long-term plans for the war in Ukraine. On Tuesday, CNN reported speaking with defense officials who claimed that the U.S. was approaching the point where it could no longer supply Kiev with weapons. And this is a quote from the article. "There are several levels of munitions in U.S. stockpiles around the world, essentially an emergency reserve that the military is not willing to part ways with. The levels of those stockpiles are classified. The U.S. has been nearing that red line. However, President Joe Biden said the U.S. reached that level last week for 105mm artillery rounds. Biden stated that the U.S. has no more conventional 105mm shells to send to Ukraine and would begin sending cluster munitions. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, Washington has sent Kiev over 2 million 155mm shells from American stockpiles. At the start of the war, the U.S. produced about 15,000 rounds per month. The Pentagon reports that it can now manufacture 30,000 shells per month. However, Ukraine is still firing more shells than the U.S. can produce, around 2,000 to 3,000 every day, a defense official told CNN. And so this is what I wanted to kind of highlight from that previous Dave DeCamp article, is the U.S. doesn't want Ukraine firing artillery. However, if you talk to a lot of former military officials, current military officials, they will acknowledge that in battles, you really do need artillery, especially in an offensive, in order to make those operations work. And so it seems like even though Ukraine clearly lacks the military equipment and capabilities they would need to carry out a successful counteroffensive, the Biden administration is pushing them to do it anyways. Now, this is I found a really interesting note from the CNN article. It says, I write here, "The situation was created because NATO had no long-term plans for Ukraine," UK Secretary of Defense Ben Wallace told CNN last week. He said NATO was poised early on for a one-night, day one offensive. No one had really asked themselves the question, well, what if day one, night one becomes week 2, week 3, week 4, Wallace said. How much of our exquisite capabilities have we actually got in stock? And I think that's been the broader question. And so what he's saying here is that no one in the North Atlantic Alliance at the start of the war was considering that this thing could go on for years. They just assumed, I guess, that it would end in a couple of days one way or another, and that would just be the end of the war, which is absurdly stupid, but the way that a lot of U.S. foreign policy is conducted. You know, you remember back to the Libyan war, the Biden administration just hoped that some leader who could unite Libya would magically come to the fore out of nowhere. When that didn't happen, Libya became a failed state, and we, you know, saw the consequences going on from that today. Now, the last thing from the CNN article I want to point out is that one senior NATO official told CNN the problem is that there is insufficient incentives for the defense industry. However, that seems absolutely ridiculous to me. American arms manufacturers report record high orders because of the war in Ukraine, and tons of countries are ramping up their defense spending. The U.S. has spent billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars on weapons that it has sent to Ukraine. And look at this, we're preparing for another $1.3 billion package. The Biden administration is expected to announce a new $1.3 billion weapons package for Ukraine in the coming days, Reuters reported on Tuesday. The funds will be provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. to purchase weapons for Ukraine as opposed to shipping them directly from U.S. military stockpiles, which is the main way the U.S. has been arming Kiev. The source told Reuters that the new package will include anti-drone air defense systems known as Vampire, that's all caps, so it's some kind of acronym, Phoenix Ghost drones, and Switchblade drones, which are both small loitering munitions, and other counter-drone systems made by Australia's Drone Shield. Because the weapon systems are being purchased, it could take months or years for them to be delivered. The report also comes as U.S. officials are warning that the Pentagon is draining its stockpiles to dangerously low levels. According to the State Department, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with $10.8 billion in USAID funds so far in the 2023 fiscal year. In the previous fiscal year, which ended September 30th for the federal government, the U.S. announced $6.3 billion in USAID funds for Ukraine, and so I do believe those funds should be pretty close to depleted. All right, so Ukraine has targeted the Kerch Bridge again, and this was a pretty big deal the first time it happens. The Crimean Bridge that links Crimea to the Russian mainland was again targeted by Ukrainian forces in a bombing early Monday morning that killed 2 civilians and injured a child. Russian authorities said the Crimean Bridge, also known as the Kerch Bridge, was targeted by drones operating on the surface of the water. The previous attack on the bridge took place in October 22 and was a truck bombing. So now let's talk a little bit about the Russian response. The Russian defense minister said Tuesday that Russian forces launched retaliatory strikes in southern Ukraine in response to the bombing of the Crimean Bridge by Ukrainian forces. Russia said that the strikes were launched against targets in Odessa, and Ukrainian authorities reported airstrikes in that city. This is the Russian Defense Ministry spokesperson. Last night, the Russian armed forces delivered multiple retaliatory strikes by seaborne high-precision weapons against sites where terrorist attacks were being plotted against the Russian Federation with the use of drone boats and against the place of their production at a ship radar plant in the area of the port city of Odessa. Ukrainian officials reported damage to homes and port infrastructure in Odessa and said that a major fire had broken out in another city. According to TASS, the Russian military claimed that it destroyed 70,000 tons of fuel for the Ukrainian military hardware. And this is again from the Russian military spokesperson. All the targets designated for strike were destroyed. Fires and detonations were registered at the destroyed sites. The Russian strikes on the port city of Odessa also came as Moscow suspended its participation in the grain deal that facilitated exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Russia said it could no longer guarantee the security of shipments out of Ukraine and said it would only return to the initiative when more obstacles to the export of Russia's agricultural goods are lifted. The bombing of the Crimean Bridge killed 2 civilians and injured a child. The bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland, is a sensitive target for Moscow. When it was first bombed in October of last year, the Russian military began large-scale missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit more about the grain deal. Russia pulled out of it. I believe they announced it on Monday, and I'm not sure they linked anything to do with the grain deal to the Kerch Bridge bombing. I do know with the Kerch bombing, Russia pointed out that, or not with the Kerch bombing, with the Black Sea export deal, Russia pointed out that Ukraine was exploiting the sea lanes created for civilian ships for military purposes. And so, but I do believe the main issue that Russia has is that Western sanctions essentially make it impossible for Russia to really get any advantage out of this grain deal. So they have canceled it. All right, next article here is from myself at the Libertarian Institute. Ukraine jails senior Orthodox cleric. Russia demands release. A senior figure in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was placed in pretrial detention. Cleric Metropolitan Pavlo is facing charges for voicing opinions deemed too pro-Russian. A Kiev court ordered Pavlo to jail on Saturday. The cleric's bail was set at nearly $900,000, and he could remain in pretrial detention for a month. The judge claimed Pavlo violated a court order by contacting a witness in his trial. Pavlo, who is also known as Petro Libid, said he did not know the person was a witness. On April 1st, Pavlo was placed in a house arrest. Though initially only scheduled for a month, the house arrest had been extended several times. The charges against Pavlo include inciting hatred and justifying the war in Ukraine. On Saturday, Moscow demanded Kiev release Pavlo. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, "We demand strict compliance by the Kiev regime with its internal legal obligations, the immediate release of Metropolitan Pavlo, who is suffering from serious illness, and the provision of proper medical care for him." She added that the arrest was yet another manifestation of the political arbitrariness and lawlessness by Kiev. And of course, Kiev has been waging a broader culture war in Ukraine designed to erase the Russian historical legacy in the country. All right, one more article that I wrote here on the Russia issue. USAID chief Power announces hundreds of millions in aid to Ukraine. USAID head Samantha Power rolled out multiple aid packages totaling hundreds of millions of dollars during a multi-day trip to Ukraine. The civilian assistance was announced as the White House prepares a new $1.3 billion tranche of weapons for Kiev. Power arrived in Kiev on Monday, revealing a new $500 million humanitarian assistance package for Ukraine. She said, "I would also like to announce the United States will provide more than $500 million in additional humanitarian assistance to our humanitarian partners to scale up their response on the front lines. This will support everything from shelter for those whose homes have been destroyed to trauma support for those who have been most affected by the war." On Tuesday, Power arrived in Odessa and announced another $250 million aid package directed to Ukrainian farmers. Through its Agricultural Resistance Initiative Ukraine, AGIR-Ukraine, USAID is providing an additional $250 million to support Ukraine's agricultural sector, she stated. According to the Kiel Institute, Washington has sent over $70 billion in aid to Ukraine since Russia invaded. Most of the assistance has come in the form of military support, roughly $43 billion. The White House is also expected to roll out a new $1.3 billion arms package for Kiev later this week. The U.S. has additionally provided Kiev with nearly $25 billion in financial assistance and $4 billion in humanitarian aid. The White House has pushed back against creating an Inspector General's office to oversee the billions in weapons and cash being transferred to Ukraine. The government in Kiev has a legacy of extreme corruption. The U.S. Inspector General for the Afghan War, John Sopko, has warned that Ukraine will be plagued with the same problems as Afghanistan if Washington does not develop appropriate oversight over the aid being sent to Kiev. And it doesn't look like that's going to be the case when the Congress tried to put some oversight in the NDAA. The White House rejected it and demanded that that be stripped out. All right, so NATO not only is planning to confront Russia in Ukraine, but also China and Taiwan. Democrat-Republican senators agree NATO expansion into Asia is inevitable. Senators Dan Sullivan and Tammy Duckworth agreed on Sunday that NATO expansion into Asia was inevitable as the Western military alliance has increasingly had its eyes on China. Both senators made the comments on NBC's Meet the Press when asked by host Chuck Todd if NATO expanding into Asia was inevitable. Sullivan replied, "I think it is, and I think it's a positive step." Sullivan was a part of the Senate delegation that attended the NATO summit in Vilnius last week. The communique that was issued by the alliance mentioned China more than a dozen times, compared to just one mention with the previous year's NATO summit communique. It wasn't just a mention of China several times, almost 20 in my count, but Chuck, you probably saw the leaders who were there. The Prime Minister of Japan, the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of Korea, Sullivan said. He added that the Senate delegation met with the Asia-Pacific leaders, calling it a really strong signal with regard to NATO. Duckworth was then interviewed by Todd, and she agreed with Sullivan about NATO expansion into Asia. "I agree with my friend, and frankly, it has already started to do with our successful AUKUS agreement between the UK, Australia, and the United States." And, I think Duckworth and Sullivan are right that this is inevitable and it's definitely happening. I'm just not as supportive of it as they are. All right, next up here. Prominent Taiwanese businessman calls for dialogue with China. All right, this is Terry Gao, a Taiwanese billionaire and politician, has called for dialogue with Taiwan and China and criticized the ruling Democrat Progressive Party, the DPP, for not engaging with Beijing. And I think this is important and good news. This is the founder of the tech giant Foxconn, and he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that Taiwan should not abandon the 1992 consensus reached between Taipei and Beijing, and that says that both sides agreed to accept the framework of one China, although the two sides had differing interpretations of what that means. And so, again, I think this is a good sign, not necessarily because it means that things are going to improve, but when establishment outlets like the Washington Post and establishment figures, at least in Taiwan, like Gao, are expressing these opinions, I think it means that there are people in positions of power who would like to see some kind of de-escalation. So a little bit of good news here. A little bit of good news. Now let's get in the bad news on China. U.S. Navy spy plane flies over Taiwan Strait. A U.S. Navy spy plane flew over the Taiwan Strait on Thursday as the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, was conducting drills to the south of Taiwan. The U.S. Navy 7th Fleet announced the flight of the Navy P-8A Poseidon, and Taiwan's defense ministry said the plane flew on the south side of the median line, an unofficial barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China said it tracked the U.S. aircraft and accused the U.S. of hyping the incident. This is a spokesperson for the PLA. The troops of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command have tracked and monitored a U.S. aircraft in the whole course and handled it in line with laws and regulations. The U.S. frequently sails warships through the Taiwan Strait, which China views as provocations. Surveillance flights have typically been less frequent and are becoming more common. The last known U.S. flight over the Taiwan Strait took place in April. Taiwan's defense ministry and the PLA's ships and planes have conducted a third day. Taiwan's defense ministry said the PLA ships and planes conducted a third day of drills on Taiwan's military. The military said it also detected Chinese aircraft crossing the median line, and of course that is the barrier between, or the unofficial barrier halfway between Taiwan and China in the Taiwan Strait. Now, as a part of these drills, I believe, Taiwan said it detected a record 16 Chinese warships around the island. And so, again, these kinds of things are notable. And it's also, important to see it in the context of the U.S.-Chinese relationship, which is just really struggling out right now. Now, we have maybe some good news here. This from Connor Freeman. Kissinger meets with Chinese defense minister amid soaring tensions. So the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, visited Beijing and met with the Chinese defense minister Li on Tuesday. This comes as tensions between the world's two largest economies have been heightened substantially as a result of the White House's bellicose military strategy aimed at China. Li said in a statement that the U.S.-China relationship has reached its lowest point since the establishment of diplomatic relations. He added, "This is because some people in the United States did not meet China halfway." Li warned against raising the tensions between Washington and Beijing, stressed that the path of peaceful development that China is pursuing is a blessing for the world, not a disaster for the world. The Chinese military chief elaborated further, insisting that Washington should have a correct strategic judgment. The future of our world will be better only when emerging countries and developed countries live in peace and development together. In the same statement, Kissinger, who played a crucial diplomatic role during the Richard Nixon administration in establishing relations with Beijing under Mao Zedong, was described as a friend of China. Kissinger has admonished the consequences of the war between the U.S. and China would be catastrophic. He also implored the two sides to urgently increase cooperation. The United States and China should eliminate misunderstandings, coexist peacefully, and avoid confrontation. Now, look, Kissinger, I don't think has any ability to direct U.S. foreign policy, and so, in a way, this could all be irrelevant. However, senior U.S. officials talking to senior, or even former senior U.S. officials talking to senior Chinese officials, I think is important, because this is the kind of stuff that Antony Blinken and members of the administration are definitely going to read and become aware of. And so any understanding that's established between Kissinger and Li could help fools like Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and others to actually understand the situation going on. You could just read antiwar.com and get it, but they're not going to do that. And so maybe it has to come from the mouth of Kissinger. All right. A couple more stories here. The Marshall Islands seeks more cooperation from the U.S. for nuclear tests. And the U.S. carried out a bunch of tests over the Marshall Islands, and now they're seeking some money from the U.S. for that. And I think they're trying to leverage some of their cooperation agreements with the United States to get that money. It's amazing. We'll ship billions of dollars to Ukraine all the time. No question about it. But a few $100 million for the Marshall Islands, when we have literally nuked their country dozens of times, 67 times, it doesn't seem like it would be a lot of reparations for that act. But that's kind of how the U.S. government plays here. If it's just going to be money that helps people, then we're not so interested in handing it out. If it's money that's going to go to our military industrial complex, then we'll throw it away like it means absolutely nothing. All right, last up here, Indonesia warns Southeast Asian nations can't be a proxy for any country. And so this is the Indonesian president saying that members of the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, can't become a proxy for any country as tensions between the U.S. and China are soaring. And of course, he's commenting on the U.S. trying to rally all these countries in the region to become allies with Washington so Washington could use them in a war against China. And he's saying, like, we don't want this in our region of the world, and I couldn't agree with him more. Unfortunately, the Washington does not, and they're going to keep trying to foment these alliances, and they'll throw some money around to try to get them to happen. All right, everybody, that's all for the show today. Just want to give everybody another reminder. Please donate to our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. Thanks for tuning in.